everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our bizarre and unusual world. Today I'm going to be covering a true crime case. Today's topic is the Hall Mills murder. Just a warning, this is a true crime murder case, so if you are sensitive to discussion about murder cases, I would go ahead and skip this episode. So let's go ahead and start with the when and where. Where and when did this case take place? The case starts around September 14th through September 16th, 1922, although it would also continue on a few years after that as well. And it takes place in Somerset, New Jersey, within the United States. As for the what exactly is this case about and what makes it so famous? This case is one of the first to be described as a media circus. The press was so involved with this case that it was just insane, especially when you look at the time, 1922, it's not like it is today. So the fact that there was such a media circus around this specific case was definitely noted during that time. So on September 16th, 1922, two bodies were found in a field near a crabapple tree. This was along a road that was often used as a lover's lane for young couples. The bodies were found by two individuals, a man and a woman. 23-year-old Raymond Schneider and his 15-year-old girlfriend, Per Bammer, are walking along this dirt road when they discovered the bodies. The bodies were of a man and a woman, and the crime scene had clearly been staged, and the bodies had been specifically placed in a certain manner. Her body was placed beside his, with her left hand reaching out to touch his right thigh. She was still in her polka dot dress and her stockings. His body was positioned with his right arm out, reaching out to kind of touch her neck, and he was dressed in a fine suit. The man's hat was placed over top of his face, as well. His business card was found at the bottom of his body near his feet, and there were torn scraps of love letters surrounding both bodies. So this crime scene was heavily staged. The bodies were meant to send a message, because just a regular murderer isn't going to stage the victims like this. Even though the bodies were very staged, the couple that found them immediately knew that these two were dead. Both of the victims had been shot in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. The man had been shot once, and the woman had been shot 3 times, and also her neck was slit. There are some reports that suggest an autopsy that was done a while later said that her tongue had been cut out as well. It's safe to say that there was a lot more aggression towards the woman than there was to the man in this case. And because of the state of their bodies, it was clear that they had been dead at least 24 hours. Who exactly were the victims within this case? Who were the two bodies that were found on September 16th, 1922? So the man was identified as Edward Hall. He was the New Brunswick priest, and it was very well known and a respected man within the community. There were notes that there were some bruising and wounds along the man's body, such as a bruise on his ear, abrasions on his finger, and a wound below his kneecap. His watch was missing from his body, but he still did have coins in his pocket. As for the woman, she was identified as Eleanor Mills, a member of the church choir. She lay beside him with a bruise on her arm, a cut on her lip, and her scarf was wrapped around her throat. Now, both of these victims were in fact married, but not to each other. And so starts the drama. Edward was married to Frances Stevens with no children, and Eleanor was married to James Mills, and they had 2 children together. While it was a pretty shady situation, especially when you're talking about the priest of the town and someone from the church choir, apparently there had been a lot of whispers around the church and the town that Eleanor and Edward's relationship seemed very inappropriate, and a lot of people suspected that there was some sort of love affair going on behind the scenes. And it was pretty much confirmed when the bodies were found together. Not only were they found together near a lover's lane, but as I said, there was love notes scattered around the bodies as part of the staging. One of the notes from Eleanor read, "Sweetheart, my true heart, I know there are girls with more shapely bodies, but I'm not caring what they have. I have the greatest part of all blessings, a noble man, deep, true, eternal love. How impatient I am and will be. I want to look up into your dear face for hours, and you touch my body close. One of the pastor's letters that was pretty much further proving their relationship read this: Darling Wonderheart, I just want to crush you for 2 hours. I want to see you Friday night alone by our road, where we can let out unrestrained that universe of joy and happiness we call ours. So this murder, scandal, love affair, all of it hit the press like crazy. And it became the talk of like everywhere. It was like the biggest thing to discuss. And in turn, the crime scene became like a tourist spot, which is so weird to me. But like every weekend they had townspeople and people would travel to this location, this Lover's Lane area, to see where these bodies were found. People were so obsessed with this case that they were taking souvenirs from the crime scene. Like even early on, like people trampled all over the crime scene and it was just pretty much destroyed. There was a lot of things that they couldn't collect properly because so many people rushed to see the crime scene, which is like, why? And then in the following weeks after, people would sell popcorn, soda, balloons at the crime scene, because it was a tourist attraction now because everyone was so obsessed with the case. The souvenirs included just like different things around the area, but the main thing was the apple tree near the bodies. People would like take branches and bark, and within a few weeks' time, the tree was pretty much completely cut down because so many people had come to take a souvenir off of this murder case. People say that modern people are weird. 1920s people sound really freaking strange to me. So why? Why were they killed, or why were they potentially killed? What's the theory? So there are some people that suggest a robbery gone wrong, as there is with a lot of similar cases to this. Wrong place, wrong time, robber killed them, but the crime scene was so staged. It was meant to send a message, so a robbery just does not make sense to me. It was clear that whoever did this knew what was going on behind the scenes and wanted to make it public. So the robbery idea, I completely pushed that aside when I was doing my research. It is safe to say that the whole town thought of this affair as the motive. So many people knew that Eleanor was Edward's mistress, and it was just a known fact that it wasn't shocking to people that they were killed together, or that could be the reason why they were murdered. They all knew of his wife, Frances, who was 7 years older than him and sometimes described as cold. And these churchgoers knew exactly what he was doing when he was spending more time with a younger Eleanor. And so it only fed the rumors, and in turn, why exactly the bodies were positioned in such a manner. So how exactly were the suspects connected to this case? Jealousy and rage were heavily talked about for this case. So of course the immediate point of the finger went to Mrs. Frances Hall. They believed that she had orchestrated or taken part in the murder of her husband and his mistress. She was from a very wealthy family, and it was well known that Edward had only married her for her money. And so as an act of revenge, when she found out about the affair, she staged the bodies in such a way that, as I said, would definitely send a message. Because of the family connection, Frances's brothers and a cousin were also suspects within this case, they had helped their sister kill her husband. That would be Henry Stevens, William Stevens, as well as their cousin Henry Carpenter, were looked into for this murder case. So Henry Stevens, one of Frances's brothers, was actually a retired exhibition marksman. So clearly the prosecution suggested that he had been the one to fire the various shots into Edward and Eleanor because he was a bit of an expert with a weapon. However, he claimed that he was away fishing the day that they had been murdered, and he had 3 witnesses that confirmed his testimony. William Stevens, the other brother, did own a .32 caliber weapon, but it was not in working condition. The firing mechanism had actually been disabled in this so that he was unable to use it, or more importantly, was unable to hurt himself. Some reports say his fingerprint was found on the business card left at Edward's feet, and others thought that his mannerisms were odd or very suspicious. However, looking back at this case, a lot of people actually suspect that William was on the autism spectrum. So yes, his actions or the way that he behaved would have been different, but that doesn't make him guilty. Henry Carpenter, Frances's cousin, was an initial suspect, but he was actually able to get it so he was tried separately from them, and when all is said and done, he was never actually brought to trial. So the first investigation in 1922 pretty much was left cold. A lot of people suspected Frances, but there was no sort of evidence to hold her, and she actually took a trip to Europe and left the cold case. Everyone within the press and everyone that was obsessed with the case was craving for more information or wanted the police to find out who had murdered this Lover's Lane couple, this juicy behind-the-scenes church affair, but there was nothing else to find out. So the case pretty much went cold in 1922. So it wasn't until 1926 when the case kind of brought back to life, and this was primarily the press's fault. They wanted more answers, and so they published some very specific headlines. Some of the headlines read, Hall Mills murder, mystery bared. Hall's bribery revealed, Mrs. Hall's spies held town in terror. How Hidden Hand balked Hall murder justice. These headlines within the different publications just sparked a frenzy, and it was so massive that the governor was forced to reopen the case. Mrs. Frances Hall and her brothers were arrested for the murder of her husband Edward and his mistress Eleanor. It was the trial of the century, if you will. Remember I said about the media circus went even crazier during the trial. There was so much press within the courtroom covering the case. It was very insane. The trial started November 3rd, 1926, so that's going to be 4 years after the initial murder. The trial lasted around 30 days with all of the news coverage. Everyone that was obsessed with the case just wanted more and more information from the daily events from the trial. The trial itself seemed to be extremely dramatic. They did things like reading out some of the letters that Edward had wrote to Eleanor and vice versa. They tried to portray Frances Hall as a cold, bitter old woman that of course killed her husband and got her brother's help. It was very clear that the prosecution was wanting to rely on the drama and the press attention to get this case solved and the trial concluded. They wanted someone to be guilty for this, so they heavily relied on some of the drama within this case. Now, the prosecution's main witness was a woman named Jane Gibson. She actually lived on a hog farm not too far from the Lover's Lane location, and she claimed to have witnessed the murders that night, and so obviously she was the key witness for this trial. She claimed to have seen and heard the gunshots and watched the two victims fall to the ground. The press actually named her Pig Lady because of her pig farm, and she was often portrayed as insane. This was just how the defense team described her as well. She was just simply crazy in their eyes. And unfortunately, she didn't exactly help her case. Her story about that night changed a lot depending on who she was speaking with, whether that be the police or investigators, what she said during the trial, or what she said to the newspapers. Her story changed quite often, so a lot of people didn't think that she was a very credible witness. Around the original case in 1922, she was pushed aside because no one believed her. Everyone truly thought that she was crazy, and they didn't believe her witness account. But for the trial in 1926, she was brought in to testify. She was actually quite ill with cancer at the time and was wheeled in on a hospital bed to the courtroom. And that is where she claimed the story of seeing Edward and Eleanor murdered, and she's the witness, blah, blah, blah. It should also be noted for this that her own mother was sitting in the front row for this trial, and the whole time her daughter was giving her testimony or whatever, her mother was saying that her daughter was a liar. She's a liar. She's not telling the truth. She's a liar. So even her own mother did not believe that she had witnessed this crime and thought that she was lying. Now, Frances, the reverend, pastor, priest, whatever, wife, and her brothers definitely had motive. Everyone could see that. But there was no evidence against them, and the jury quickly acquitted them, and that was that. The case was over. And after the trial concluded, Frances actually sued some of the publications that wrote some of the articles about her. She sued the New York Daily Mirror and the New York Times for defamation of character. Like I said, the press had been heavily obsessed with this case, and they had dedicated more print to this particular case than they had in the whole of American history. There has been a lot of research and books written about this case. It's even inspired some fiction. Some people go into detail about how they truly believe that the siblings were to blame, that Frances and her brothers murdered her husband and his mistress for their cheating affair and for, you know, kind of ruining the image when you're like the head of the church and then you have a mistress from the church. It's not too good. So a lot of people really believe that the siblings were behind this murder, while other people suggest that it was just a stranger that wandered into town. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then that person just took off. That's why they never found him. Was the pig woman the actual killer? She did claim to see them that night. Did she actually kill them for being near her property and then spun it a different way? If the rest of the town knew about their affair, maybe that's why she placed them the way that she did, to make it seem like it was Frances, Edward's wife, or even Eleanor's husband. There's even like some talk about how some people think that the KKK was involved because it like went against their moral code or something like that. A lot of it didn't really sit with me, didn't reach out to me at all. There's also some theories about Eleanor's daughter finding out about the affair and her teenage daughter being the murderer, and, you know, would kind of make sense with how the bodies were placed if it was her daughter. But like most unsolved murder cases, there are dozens of theories. I for sure think that Edward's wife, Frances, had motive, and that potentially her brothers could have helped her, and they had money, so is that how they kept the town quiet? Or they were able to get away with it? I mean, even Eleanor's husband could have had something to do with it since his wife was cheating as well. But the thing is, there's no evidence. The first investigation didn't do anything, and even the trial, they were completely acquitted. So there's no evidence to support that it was Frances or her brothers. I'm personally open to another idea that it could have been someone else within the town or the church. A lot of the reports are saying that so many of the churchgoers knew exactly what their church leader and this choir singer were doing behind the scenes, that it was just a known secret that Eleanor was his mistress. And so if they didn't agree with this, they didn't agree with the affair, and they thought that it looked bad on the church or the town, maybe they took matters into their own hands. It could have been easily someone else. They're saying that this whole group of townspeople knew about this affair. Why wasn't it somebody else that didn't like what was happening? And still, they were placed in such a manner that would out their relationship. The love letters would scatter around and have evidence that they were in fact having an affair, and then in turn you get kind of rid of the bad seed from your church. I don't know. That's kind of a theory that I came up with as I was doing this research, but I would love to know what you guys think about this case. Had you heard about this case? I hadn't until I started researching. What do you think? Who do you think murdered Edward and Eleanor? As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next episode.